please start the recording. And it will be posted to our ginniemay.gov website following the completion of this session. A few house rules for this training section today. We ask that you please save all questions to the end of the presentation. You can obviously use the Q&A option section anytime throughout the presentation, but we ask that you save other communications of questions to the end of the presentation and the demo. We also ask that you use the Q&A to submit those questions and not the chat. Again, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and not the chat to submit questions. And then finally, please do not submit questions regarding your specific PDD or errors that you've received on your PDD. We ask that you email us at ginniemay_misno_support@hud.gov and provide us your availability to set up a meeting where you can provide us with your PDD file and we can discuss your specific PDD errors and how to resolve them one-on-one. We don't want to do that here on the call. So with those rules of engagement being done, let's get started with the presentation. All right. So today we will be sharing with you our validation and testing tool. We're going to give you an overview. We're also going to discuss the various iterations your PDD file goes through when you use the validation and testing tool, the validation process itself. And then John Sincat of Deloitte will be providing you all with a live demo of the application. And we'll also share some tips for PDD development that we think will be helpful to you guys. And also provide you with some key resources that we've already made available on our ginniemay.gov website, as well as how you can contact us with questions, concerns, or updates on your SFPDM implementation timeframe. And then finally, we'll end with Q&A. And give you all an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have. All right, next. Validation and testing tool overview. So the purpose of this tool that is within our My Ginnie portal is for our issuers, single family issuers to be specific, to be able to test and validate the PDD files that you all have developed prior to using SFPDM. This is important. We want you to test the various products you typically deliver to Ginnie Mae in the VTT to ensure you know the file requirements and the business rules for them all before you start to use SFPDM. This just makes for an easier transition for all of us, you and for our support teams. So please make sure you test your PDD files that you develop or receive from your vendor. Test them first in the validation and testing tool prior to using SFPDM. Next, the process that happens within the validation and testing tool is a two-step process. The first step that your file will go through is a structural validation to verify the XML file structure or schema, and to verify and validate the data formats of the various elements that you all are doing. And then next, it goes through basically a two-step business rule validation process that we'll go through in a little more detail a little bit later. And that's where we confirm that your file is adhering to Ginnie Mae's business rules. So you will not receive all of your errors associated with your PD file at one time. It is an iterative process that performs different validations at different times, which we'll, as I said, go over in a little more detail a little later and during the demo. Lastly, access. If you currently submit single-family pools through GinnieMat, then you should already have access to the validation and testing tool and to SFPDM application. Both of those are in our My JennyNet portal. So if you currently deliver through JennyNet, you should have access to the application already. Now I'm going to hand it over to John Simon of Deloitte, our validation and testing tool expert, who will review the validation process and perform our VTT demo. John?
Yep, thanks, Nicole. So on this slide, we're going to talk a little more in detail about the VTT validation process. As Nicole mentioned earlier, there's two distinct rounds of validation, but looking into a little more detail here. Round one consists of the structural validations, while round two contains two distinct waves of validations, the first being pre-store and data integrity, and the latter being the business rule validations. So starting off sequentially here on the left with structural validations, these are checks to essentially make sure that the file submitted to the VTT adheres to the XML schema definition that we've established and have published as defining the PDD essentially. So when you go through that first round validation and your file is compared to that XML schema definition, if it doesn't meet those requirements, it will fail and you'll encounter a first round error report, which we'll see shortly in the demo after this slide. Or if your file passes, it meets all those structural validations, you'll have the opportunity to proceed to the second round of validation. Or if all you were interested in was the structure, you can exit the application at that point. So a couple of commonly occurring errors here are, you can see two of them there, first being that the value of pool maturity date is not valid. And another example is that the content of the element, in this case, the down payment container, is not complete. The funds type data point is expected. So as you can kind of tell by these errors, it's looking either at the placement of your containers or data points, or from a data standpoint, looking at the value and seeing if it meets our expectations. We'll get into this in a little bit, but one of the main documents that you'll probably be referring to as you address structural validation errors will be our VTT user manual, and we'll show you how to get there in a little bit. But if you pass the first round, you'll click that you want to proceed to the second round. And like I said, the first sort of wave of the second round errors or validations are pre-store and data integrity. So all second round errors show up as part of one report. However, pre-store and data integrity validations are looking with a little more scrutiny at the values that are entered for your data points. And if some of them don't meet the validation expectations, then your file won't be able to be correctly read by the business rules. And in effect, if you don't resolve some of those pre-stored data integrity errors, you will not be able to see the full scope of the business rule errors as part of that second round report. And so in these instances, it'll be called out in the VTT. But essentially, it's one last round of sort of data cleanup, checking to make sure that your file is structured in a way that we can read it for the business rules and compare the file against them. So some examples you see down there at the bottom are LTV ratio percent for a loan cannot be blank, or the mortgage program type for a loan cannot be blank. The last sort of wave is the proper business rule validations in the second round. So if you encounter any errors there, again, your file this time is being compared properly against Ginnie Mae's business rules to make sure that in even more scrutiny and detail that the values meet the business rules and that they sort of tick and tie with each other as some of the data points are interrelated. If you have any errors, it will be called out. You'll get a second round error report that's generated in a slightly different way, which again, we'll touch on the next slide. Or if your file passes all of them, you'll get a successful message letting you know that it was successful. And so some commonly occurring errors here are invalid or missing pool taxpayer identifier, should be numeric, or invalid security trade book entry date, should be a current or future date. And so when you're going through your second round errors, the documents that tend to be the most useful are our PDD implementation guide appendix D document, or our business rules and error guide, which again, we'll show you all of those shortly, but just as a little bit of a teaser before we jump into the demo here. With that, I will cut to the demo and shift my screen here to the validation and testing tool. So here you can see I'm signed into the My Ginnie Mae portal. And from here, if you go to the tools window or the tools dropdown and click on PDD Validation and Testing Tool, assuming you have the correct role access, which all issuers should if they already submit single family pools, you'll be navigated to this page here. So pretty straightforward application. Over here on the left, when you want to test a file, you click the Choose File button. And so right now we're going to run through a few different files, all based off of the same scenario, sort of showing you the different kinds of errors you encountered, actually the ones that we just reviewed. And in doing so, sort of show the life cycle as sort of sped up as you work through resolving those errors, working from file that has errors to getting one that completely passes. So clicking on Choose File here, it'll bring up your directory and we'll run this first test file here. Click Test File to perform our structural validation, our first round. And so this is the first round error report. It's structured so that it says the line number of the error, the category, and the description, the message, which is actually going to be the most helpful in solving it. So the first error here that we talked about, the content of element down payment is not complete. One of funds type is expected. So this is basically saying the funds type data point needs to be included if the down payment container is there. For those who aren't as familiar with the tool or are newer to the VTT, as I said, one of the useful documents for resolving structural validations is going to be our user manual. So switching tabs here, this is the main ginniemay.gov website. And to navigate to the VTT user manual, go to Issuers, Issuer Training, Tools and Resources. Scrolling down a little further, we have User Manuals. And you'll be looking for the PDD XML Validation Testing Tool User Manual. And the reason I cut to this file here is because if we scroll down, once it loads, to, I believe it's section 7.5, we'll get an error mapping that speaks to the schema validation categories we just saw. So jumping back to the VTT, as someone more familiar with the application, it's easier to interpret what this means, but again, for someone new, you'll see the category here, CVC complex type 2.4b, we have a mapping here, which basically says missing element. Okay, it says that an element's missing, and then you could tell that funds type is what you need under down payment. So helping translate it a little bit for those who are newer to the tool. The other error we were talking about is the value 2053 April 1st of the element pool maturity date is not valid. In this case, it's not the lack of a data point, but rather the value that's actually entered in there. And we have another schema error speaking to the same data point, which gives a little more clarity. So it says that value is not valid with respect to this line here, which is the data pattern that's expected for pool maturity date. And again, basically for instances where data format is not met, if you cut back to the user manual, section 7.6 doesn't have a mapping for all of them, but it'll show samples of how to better interpret that if you're newer to this. So if I'm looking through this, I could see the main problem here is that what it's expecting in this last element here, the day field, is 15 or 20. Basically what it's saying is that 2053 April 1st is not a valid value for pool maturity date. It needs to be the 15th or the 20th for that month. And to kind of get more familiarity with that, you can pull up examples that we have documented already for different data points. It shows their patterns. Again, there's a few different types, and then sort of more plain English explains them here. So if you need help kind of interpreting that, this would be a good guide. And then the last thing I want to point out is this doesn't apply just to schema validation. It could also apply to round 2. But just want to call out that another useful document as users are going through the process of testing in the VTT is our PDD Implementation Guide, Appendix D, which is also on the Ginnie Mae website, but in a slightly different area. It's under Issuers, Modernization Initiatives, and we'll have a slide that shows where all of these are. But just to cut down here, MISMO, scrolling down, we have our PDD Implementation Guide and its various appendices. So Appendix D is what tends to be helpful for a lot of users, and I already have a copy open, so I'll go right to it. But the tab version 3.0 MISMO data points is helpful. And so basically, if you're going through the testing effort and you want more clarity on, let's say, the funds type or pool maturity date data point, you can open Appendix D if you want some more clarity on it. Column D here is where you can filter for the data point name. So I'll search for funds type in this instance. And here it'll show the sort ID, it'll show the XPath, meaning all the containers you have to work through to get there down to the data point, the parent container, in this case, down payment, as we know from the error, and then some other background information, business name, MISMO definition, and a lot of other relevant fields as well, including the conditionality details and implementation notes. So we tend to find that in most cases, these errors provide enough context to sort of solve them on their own. But if you're looking for more background, again, you can reference the user manual for the different data patterns or just a mapping of what those categories really mean. Or if you're curious about the data points specifically that are causing errors, you can jump into Appendix D to get a better idea or more background information on them as a resource.
Hey, John, this is Renee. Before you move on, thank you so much for explaining where all those resources are located. For those of you, I know that was a lot of information. So for those of you who are looking for a link to be able to access those user materials, the team has provided the links to those materials in the chat. So if you're wondering where you can find them, the links are available to you right now in the chat. All right.
Yep, good call. Thank you, Renee. All right, so we're going to go ahead and exit validation here. And in our imaginary scenario, we've addressed those errors that we got in our first round. And now fast forwarding in the life cycle here, we'll run the next iteration of our file. Again, same scenario across the board here. But now we've fixed those schema errors. We'll go ahead and run it. First round validation, bar loads. And now you see we get an initial validation successful screen. Letting us know that we passed structural validations and we can either move on to the second round or again, exit if we'd like to, but we're going to move on here. You get a message letting you know that validation has started, and you actually get the message this time for the results of second round up here in the message icon for within the My Ginnie Mae portal overall. So click on that. We saw it pop up just a second ago. Click to enlarge and we'll see that validations are complete, but the file did not pass business rule validations. And we can click on this little hyperlink here to view those results. So this is what the second round error screen looks like. It's a little bit different. You'll see there's calling out pool ID and loan ID rather than the row of the file this time. It'll call out type. It could be error or warning. Errors will prevent your file from passing. Warnings will not. You'll get the error category or error message code as we refer to it often. And then you'll get the description of the error. And most notably here, again, what we're seeing are pre-stored data validation or data integrity errors. Because we want to show that part of the life cycle. And when these instances appear, again, we're probably not seeing the full scope of the business rule errors because these aren't resolved yet. And there's a little footer down here that calls it out. So it says error codes. Not going to read them all out, but these two error codes are data integrity validation errors. As such, some or all business rules will not be visible until they're resolved. So just as a heads up, even when you fix them, there might be some more behind them. These usually tend to be pretty straightforward. Again, you could see that mortgage program type for loan, that value cannot be blank. LTV ratio percent for the loan can't be blank. And these values here are the loan IDs that you're entering as part of the PDD file, also called out over here on the left. And we also have in the business rules and error guide sort of a list of them. I'll go to that in a second when we see the full business rule errors. But if we take this, we address this feedback we're getting from the VTT, we can again kind of fast forward to our, or through to our next scenario. So now there's 2 data points that are missing for those loans. We've now included them, and we're going to run our 3rd iteration of the file here. Click test file. First round is a success. We'll click continue validation and move on to 2nd round. Again, await our notification here. Click on that, view the results. And so once again, we get the 2nd round error screen, but now the values are different, or the errors are different, and you'll notice there's no footers. So now we know what we're looking at are true business rule errors, not pre-stored or data integrity checks. You can see that some of the errors have either errors or warnings have a pool or loan ID. So these are loan level, in this case, warnings. These errors do not have a loan ID, meaning they're pool level errors. So a little bit of a distinction there to help you as you try and resolve them during the troubleshooting process. And again, warnings will not prevent your file from passing as called out in this little paragraph here in the bottom right. So if your file has just warnings, it will successfully pass business rule validations, but if it has a single error, it will not. And so now we're taking a look at down here, the errors that we were just talking about before on the previous slide. So invalid or missing pool taxpayer identifier, it should be numeric. So what that likely means is there were letters included in the value, but it should all be numbers in those digits. And then the other business rule here, invalid pool security trade book entry date, it should be a future date. So again, I think this previous error is more straightforward. The second one, it says it should be a future date, but if we need a little more context around the logic of that error, we can cut to the Ginnie Mae business rules and error guide. So that is found under issuers, tools and resources, other aids, and you see here single family pooling business rules and error guide. So again, I already have it up. Pull that up. But this document has tabs for pre-store validation errors, data integrity errors, and of course, business rule errors. So it's essentially a list of all the business rule errors that we have and the rules that they tie to give a little more flavor and context behind why you might be encountering the error if you don't feel that the message itself is sufficient. So using this one as an example here, you can literally copy it from the report. Go ahead and paste it here in the error code column of tab 5, business rules and errors. And so now we see this is the error we encountered. I'll zoom in a little bit. Invalid security trade book entry date should be a future date. But if you move to column E, you can see the rule description. You need to click in sometimes to see the full scope. I don't know why it's giving me some trouble here. I'm going to unfilter, so that was row 33. But here you can see the rule associated with that error, and then you can see the rule description. So we get more context. The date can't be blank, it has to be valid, it has to be greater than pool issue date, it has to be after today's current date, within the same month as the pool issue date, and on a business day. So if you meet all those requirements, you won't be running to the errors called out that are associated with it, and in this case specifically, the one that we were just showing. So just another resource that you can use to help solve. You can also go to Appendix D and filter for the data point if you'd like to, similar to funds type, again, if you just want more context on the field itself. So a lot of different resources to use, but the business rules and error guide is usually going to be the most helpful for a second round. And so if we resolve these errors, and if we choose to resolve the warnings, return to tool and show, the final file that we have is the passing sample, where we'll run it. It will pass first round, proceed to the next round of validation. Wait a second for results, and you can already tell by the icon that this file is passing here. So this file successfully passes business rule validations. If you want to see the results, it's just going to be a success message. But that is basically the end goal, right? As we work through those different phases of errors. And then your PDD file is good to go. The one thing I want to call out before I jump out of this demo here is that, or a couple things, I guess. The VTT does not save data that's submitted to it. All the file is stored in memory, and as soon as you submit the file and you get the business rules back, the data is gone, so it's not saved by the system. However, one thing that is saved for convenience of the users is the error reports. So if you want to ever go back, you can see all the sample files that we just ran. I can go back and open one of the error reports. So if I go to the past, most recent round 2, you can still view them. They'll be right here. So if you ever need to go back and check them out. Also, one other thing, if it's useful for your team, you can export it to a .csv file. These will all be separate columns, and you can work through it that way as well, so that you don't have to keep popping in here. You can just save that down. But yeah, those are sort of the main checkpoints, I'd say, as you go through the process. Again, just wanted to give you examples of what those most common errors are, or some of the most common errors of the different types, show the documents that you would use to resolve them, and just how to navigate the tool in general. So thank you for watching along, and we can cut back to the main slides here. So moving forwards, just a few tips for PDD development that we want to call out that issuers or just organizations in general tend to sometimes run into. One is the file encoding type. So the file encoding for your PDD file needs to be UTF-8. That's declared at the top of the file as we specify in our PDD implementation guide. But also sometimes what issuers aren't aware of is when you save the file, you need to make sure it's saved as UTF-8. UTF-8 BOM encoding will not be viable. It'll cause import errors in SFPDM and VTT. So just calling out that both when you declare it at the top of your file and save it, make sure your encoding type is specifically UTF-8. And just another note on that is that sometimes when you edit an XML file with apps like Notepad or WordPad applications, we've seen users realize that it unknowingly shifted the encoding to UTF-8 BOM. So again, just to be clear, that's something to keep an eye out for. The encoding type should be visible on whatever sort of tool or application you're using to edit your XML. So that's just something we're checking if you're getting import issues. Data points. So you already saw that one of our business rule errors in that example was related to the date. A lot of the data points in the PDD are treating your file as if it was being submitted today for actual pooling. And so if you're using older data or just test data or old pools in the VTT, which a lot of users tend to do, just be aware that you're going to run into some errors regarding the date. So until you submit a file that could truly or has dates that reflect information as if you're trying to submit it for pooling that day, you might run into some errors there. So that always needs to be up to date. And then we already touched on it, but access to the VTT, all issuers that currently submit single family pools should have access to the tool, and vendors can request access by reaching out to Ask Ginny May at HUD.gov. The last slide here before we get to questions, I'm not going to read through all of these, but we have a lot of different key resources across sort of the different main components of this adoption effort. So if you have questions around the PDD, we have documents you can see up there, most notably the implementation guide. We have documentation around SFPDM, the production pooling application, and the relevant references there. And the VTT, obviously what we went over today, we talked about the user manual. We'll have a VTT training recording. We already have older ones up, and this one will be made available in a little while afterwards. And then we also have VTT quick reference cards, which speak to a few specific situations that users have encountered before and want a little more clarity on. So lots of different resources there. As far as getting more one-on-one help, if you have specific questions, You can reach out to either our Ginnie Mae customer support phone lines by calling the number and using the different extensions depending on your question. There's separate communication channels, whether your question is dealing with the PDD or the VTT, versus if you have questions about the production pooling application, SFPDM. So again, for those here that are just getting started in the development process and want to learn more about the VTT, you'll be calling that first number. And sort of same kind of split between communication channels is also present. We have mailboxes for both. So if questions about the PDD or VTT, go to the Ginnie Mae MISMO support at HUD.gov mailbox, or questions about SFPDM, go to Ask Ginnie Mae at HUD.gov. But that closes out the main portion of our presentation here, so we can open it up to Q&A. And Nicole, I think I'll be handing it back over to you.
Thank you so much, John. Appreciate that. That was a great demo. Really appreciate how you incorporated the various resources that we have available and how those can be used to help people manage their PDD development. Great job. Okay, with that said, once again, we're about to open up for questions and answers, and we ask that you submit your questions through the Q&A icon and not the chat. Again, we also ask that you do not submit questions regarding your specific PDD or errors. We would rather you use some of those resources that we just mentioned, our phone numbers and our mailboxes, to set up some one-on-one time where you can provide us with your file and we can go over your errors and help you resolve them one-on-one. So with that, is there anyone with their hand raised?
Hey, Nicole, this is Renee. I'm just going to jump in really quick.
Okay.
So as you can see here on the screen, there are 3 different ways that you can ask your questions. You can either first raise your hand by hovering towards the bottom of your screen, towards the reaction icon, and select the raise hand button. And that'll let us know that you have a question. If you've dialed in from your phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand. And then the host who will be able to read the last 4 digits of your phone number, and that will indicate to us that you have a question. Or as Nicole mentioned, you can type your question in the Q&A that's available here, which we have plenty of them that have already come in. I'm sure there is one question that has either been asked or will be asked later, and that is, will this presentation be made readily available to you? And the answer to that question is yes. Immediately following today's training session, the presentation will be available on the issuer training page under tools and resources, under single family training presentations, and it'll be the validation and testing tool training. So if someone from the team can please pop that URL in the chat, so folks will be able to access the presentation right after this call. And then following that, the actual demo of today's call will also be made readily available to you all early next week. And once it is available and published to the website, a My Ginnie Mae portal message and e-notification will be sent announcing that the recording is available for you all to view. Okay.
Thank you so much, Renee. That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so I can go ahead and moderate the Q&A so that way the SMEs on the call can respond to the questions. All right, so we'll start with the first one. And someone just mentioned that they are not able to see the chat box. So if you're not able to see the chat box, if you could just take your mouse and hover over the bottom of your screen, in Zoom, that bar at the bottom of your screen will then populate and you'll be able to see everything you need to see. You can unmute yourself. If you want to show us who you are, you can start a video. And it'll show you also the Q&A box as well as the chat box. So if you would like to see the links that were mentioned during today's session, all of the links to the user materials are there. All right, the next question is, where do you fix validations? The errors if you have to manually add the information? And this is from Peggy Casper. So I can reread that. It says, where do you fix validation errors if you have to manually add the information?
Is this a scenario with manual entry?
Or are they referring to the actual XML file itself? If you have to add a data point that was missing, how do you add it to the XML itself?
Hey, Peggy, if you can, if you dial it in from a phone, if you can press *9 to raise your hand, or if you are joining from your computer or laptop, if you can just unmute yourself to clarify this question, or you can clarify further down in the chat or in the Q&A if you like. But we just need we need those clarifying questions answered before we can respond to that question. Okay.
Renee.
Yes.
Sorry.
This is Peggy. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Well, I'm one of those users that haven't used the validation tool yet because we just haven't done it yet. So what I'm just thinking in my head here is if you have to do something manually, maybe you're uploading it and there's missing information that maybe is not in the loan origination system, or I'm doing it manually. I mean, maybe I'm just premature because haven't really tried it yet. Yes, I know we have to have it by July. I understand that, but I've tried. So I guess maybe I just have to wait till I actually do a validation, but I'm thinking, well, what if I don't have that information that was in the upload and I actually have to put it in?
Oh, okay. So you're saying you don't actually have the information that may be a required field?
Yeah,
I mean, you could put something in, just as a placeholder for the field and then edit it once you import it into SFPDM.
well, that's not really a placeholder. You still have to put information in eventually.
Yeah, you are going to have to put the information in eventually. Is that what you're saying? Or if you don't
Well,
have it available to you
yeah,
at the
maybe
time that you're doing the import?
maybe it's not in the loan origination system. Maybe I have to look at a document and manually add it. I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking ahead here. Because if we haven't uploaded, we haven't used the validation tool at all. So I'm unsure. I'm seeing the errors, what they show here, and I need to see what needs to be fixed. You can't change the loan origination system to create that file,
Yeah, so John talked through the various stages in the VTT. That first stage, the structural validations are going to check to make sure that the file is complete. So you will need to have all of the required fields to even move on to the second round of validation. Once you get to the business rules and errors for the VTT, you have to correct the file and then reload it in. But in terms of your production, you would be able to manually update things in SFPDM, but that would only be the business rule errors after it initially passes the structural validations. So
okay,
you do have a complete file.
Okay, so yeah, so I have to have that. So that's really a programming, the first one's really a programming issue, and they've got to put that information there or it doesn't go any forward. Now,
Correct.
What if you're doing something manually, like since you started entering information manually, then you skip the validation tool altogether, right?
Yes, if you're doing manual submission, yes, you can just go straight to SFPDM.
Okay, and then if you're loading like modifications, loans that have been remodified, that because of COVID or all that, and you're still going to have to go look for some of these loans. I mean, they're new loans because they're modified, right? I'm going to have to look through the file and find out all the different codes that are needed for these old loans. I mean, like the source of the down payment or some of those things that we don't necessarily have in the loan origination system because it's all going to be a manual input.
Yeah, if you were to go that route, but the purpose of the first round is to make sure that you are getting all the data points out of your system. But perhaps our team could set up a meeting and talk through your situation in more detail.
Yeah, I think I'll send an email and we'll do that, but I'm kind of in a flux. Okay, thank you.
Do you have a specific vendor that you use, Peggy?
We're using Encompass.
Okay,
Well,
all right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Those were all very good questions. Thank you.
let me try to mute you now.
Malika, before I move on, are there any hands raised?
Yes, we have a couple.
Okay.
The first one is Gregory McKitt. Gregory, can you?
Yeah, I'm still here. I think I had the hand raised sign up there, but I did want to give a shout out to your to the Bank of New York group there. They helped me through the subscriber information there. I don't know, for those of you that have tested there, there's probably 3 to 5 new fields that are added on that subscriber information. And we were kind of clueless on that information there, because the old system there does not have these fields. So that was the question that I brought up last week there. But like I said, they Bank of New York, they stepped up and they gave us assistance on it there, and I really appreciate their help on it. But that's all I had.
Thank you so much for that, Gregory. We appreciate good feedback as well. Thank you so much to the Bank of New York Mellon team. They are on the call, so they've heard your acknowledgments. Thank you so much.
Okay, Malika, are there any other hands raised?
Yes, there are still 2 more. The next one is Jen Offner. Jane, can you still hear us?
She has to unmute, right?
Mm-hmm. Maybe Jen, if you can submit your question in the chat so we can make sure that we can get to it, since we're not able to hear you.
That's Jan too, from Central National. We just talked with her, so sorry we missed you, Jan. It sounds like you're having difficulty unmuting, but definitely feel free to put something in the Q&A if you get a chance.
Okay, and the last hand raised right now is Kyle Grisby.
Grigsby, hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Could you demonstrate business rule error correction through the SFPDM?
No, we can't demonstrate that here. That is actually in the you're talking about demonstrating the business rule correction in SFPDM.
Yeah, so if you pass validation or the structural part, the first validation check, what I just heard was, as long as you pass that, you can't pass that or correct any of that through the SFPDM. So that must be passed through the VTT first. But what I heard is that, or that I just heard on this call, is that business rule validations can be corrected through the SFPDM and don't have to only be corrected through the VTT. Is that true?
So the VTT is our testing application for the PDD. That's just where you confirm that you've built your PDD correctly, or your vendor has built your PDD correctly, and it has all of the necessary fields, elements, data points in the proper order and in the proper format, and that you can correctly get those files validated for all of the products that you typically deliver to Ginnie Mae. Once you confirm that you can create a valid PDD file, then you pass validations for all of those files, both validations, structural and business rules, then is when you start to go to use SFPDM for your regular production pool submissions. And yes, you can go into SFPDM to edit your file once it's been imported.
Okay, so you can correct.
If you need to. Yes.
You could correct. some stuff with through the SFPDM, but it's recommended to correct everything to the VTT.
Well, to correct your structure and make sure you have all of your necessary fields, because you have to make sure you have all the required data points first in your file on a regular basis before you start using SFPDM. We don't want you to have to troubleshoot your file through SFPDM, because that clogs up our production and the delivery of business tools. So we'd like for you to use the testing tool to confirm that your file is built correctly first. And then we can work out all of your errors and issues and problems with that file in the VTT first. Once you validated that you have a good file, you don't have to go back to the VTT anymore. You can just use SFPDM for your normal monthly delivery.
Okay, and final question, how long will the VTT be available after the cutover date, and when specifically is the cutover date?
We have not determined how long the VTT will be available, but it will be available for a while. We will be sending out communications next month in May that will speak to the JNet cutover date.
Okay, so then if there is an end or sunset to the VTT, will it then be recommended to do all validation testing through the SFPDM only?
We have not yet determined.
Okay. Thank you.
I mean, I think, can I just jump in?
Sure.
Yeah, I think the idea is, once you get going and you validated some pools through the VTT and you're in your regular periodic, pool delivery monthly activities, you're in SFPDM. So, and it has a very similar structure in the sense that you're at the minimum, your XML import file has to clear the structural validation, because that allows the system to actually save those values into the database, right? If the structure is right. And then if you have business rule validations that needs to be corrected, you have two options. You can correct them on the screen, or you can correct them in your XML import and just re-import it and overwrite your pool.
Okay, so if you're using an LOS, what you're hoping is that the LOS will be able to correct structural issues at some point in the future, and that all corrections, hopefully in the future, will be business rule related. That can be corrected on the screen.
Yeah, but just keep in mind, like as Nicole said, it depends what stage you are, in the pooling. If you're just starting out, you have to use the VTT. And if you're, a couple of months into pooling, you should, the assumption is that you don't have too many errors, you understand the structure, then you just go into pool. You don't need to test.
Great, thank you.
All right, thanks guys for all the questions. So we have about 9 more minutes left in the call. So just to put folks at ease, if we don't get to your question during the call, we do have your names and information captured in the Q&A. So we will be able to reach out directly to you to respond to your questions if we don't get to them during the call. So our next question is from Nicole Beister, I believe it is. I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. So her question is, do they need to have all errors fixed on the first round in order to get to the second round? And if not, how do they get to the second round after the first round?
Yep, I can speak to that. So specifically for the VTT, until you complete, until your file that you submit is free of all first round errors, like you saw, you're not going to be able to proceed to second round. So they all have to be cleared up first.
All right, thank you, John. The next question, will the chat be captured in the recording? So no, the chat will not be captured during the recording. However, if you, Lauren Heffernan, if you did miss out on the links to the user materials, if someone could put in the Q&A rather at this point, or maybe in the chat, yeah, the website to Ask Jenny May. And so that way, Lauren, you can reach out directly to us and we can provide those links to you.
Also, those links are available in the presentation itself,
yes,
which I think is already available on our website, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Correct, yes.
So, yes. All of the links that we shared with you today are included in this presentation and are currently available.
All right, our next question is from Cindy Arellano, and her question is, will the PDD validation and testing, will the PDD validation and TT validations, the same validations we get when we import a pool and click on validate, or are these different and need to be checked prior?
Yeah, I can take this one. I'm going to take some, or first want to clarify quickly, the PDD is the data set and data requirements itself. I'm going to take some liberties and assume that maybe the question was comparing validations between the VTT, as we saw here, and SFPDM, I think is what they meant when they import a pool and click the validate button there. For the most part, the validations are the same. The one difference is that SFPDM has some extra errors specific to that tool, more in tune with your issuer number, some values that can't be validated from a VTT standpoint. In those cases, the business rule and error guide file that we showed has a tab for SFPDM only errors. So for the most part, they're the same, but there are a few extra that you'll be dealing with once you're in the production pooling application. But if you're all good with testing the VTT, it'll be set up in a very, very good spot for the time that you get into SFPDM.
There's a follow-on question. How long does it take for the second round errors to come into the messages?
Pretty quickly. I think you guys saw it only took a few seconds. Larger files can take a little bit longer, but usually we're talking about differences on the order of seconds here. Get the responses pretty quick.
All right, and our next question is, will we be able to test manual entries on the ULDD in the future?
This question is throwing me for a loop a little bit. So manual entry, again, that's a function that's specific to the pooling application SFPDM. If you're doing manual entry, then that's where you'd be doing it. You won't be doing any testing in the VTT. And as far as ULDD, obviously our data set is the PDD, which is unique in its own right for Ginnie Mae. But if the general question is, will you be able to perform manual entries in the future in SFPDM? The answer is yes.
And you can actually start using SFPDM right now if you're doing manual entry. There's no reason for you to be waiting because the system is available and you don't need a file. So if you do manual entry, you can start using SFPDM today. You should have access if you currently have access to Ginnie.
Okay, our next question is from Christina. Her question is, can we see the minimal XML example used for the validations on these examples? So she wants to know, where can they see the examples?
Christina, we don't have these files that we showed available on the website, but we do have in PDD implementation guide. Appendix C has 5 different sample scenarios for you to reference. And it was actually scenario 5 within Appendix C that we sort of modified a little bit to encounter these errors. So Appendix C will have all passing files, but if you want to kind of see the base that we used for this test example for the sort of life cycle steps, scenario 5 in Appendix C would be where you're looking.
All right, and Kyle Grisby has a question. I think we may have answered this already. How long will the VTT bill? Yes, we already answered that question, Kyle. I believe you asked that aloud. So again, just to reiterate, his question was, how long will the VTT be available after the cutover, and when is the cutover date? And so Nicole mentioned that we're not quite sure about that yet, and communications will be sent out later on next month to communicate that. Lovey Ann has a question, and her question is, can we use the same zip file with no errors to import into SFPDM? And she wanted for us to show how that works, but we only have 3 minutes left, so I'm not quite sure we have enough time to provide it.
Yeah, we won't be able to show that example, but to answer the question, yes, if your zip file has no errors, if your PDD file has no errors in the VTT, then you can import it into SFPDM. As long as you don't have any structural errors, then it can be imported into SFPDM, as we talked about before. And then from there, if maybe some of the SFPDM specific errors are encountered, you can resolve them afterwards. But yes, you can import the same file into both systems if it's passing.
All right, the next question is again from Christina. Oh, good, we got a thumbs up on that. Glad we were able to answer that question for you. How can we go about, it's from Christina. She wants to know how can they go about correcting VTT errors, and again, would like to have an example shown if one of their loans is missing data.
Yeah, so Christina, part of the reason we didn't show the actual resolution process is because everyone's process is a little bit different. If you use an LOS vendor and you're seeing issues with the data that's provided to you, you might need to touch base with them about why what's being produced for you isn't meeting the VTT's, structural requirements if you're missing a data point. Or if someone's just handling their system custom on their own, you could just open the XML file itself and edit it and then add that loan. So it's a little bit different for everyone, but at the end of the day, what matters is that the XML file that gets submitted needs to be modified. So however your business process handles changing the XML file itself, that's really the root of what needs to get done to resolve them.
Okay, and we have time for one more question. And this is from Kat Schultz. And the question is that they have submitted multiple emails to both support boxes, but unfortunately have not been able to get a response. How long does it normally take for them to answer? First, yeah, I was like, sorry.
We are so sorry to hear that. That's not our typical response time. So Kat, if we have your name and number, we'll make sure we contact you for any communications that we may have missed and send those out to you right away. Thanks.
Yeah, the last email that we have from you, Kat, was from, we sent a response on April 5th. So I'm not sure if you reached out since then.
All right. Okay, so Kat did mention that she has submitted 5 emails this week. So again, Kat, we have your information and definitely apologize, and the team will be sure to get back to you since we have not been able to so much. You are very welcome. Very welcome. Again, apologies that we did not get to answer all of your all's questions. However, the questions that were answered and the ones that have not, I've been able to kind of go through. You all have some phenomenal questions, and we will be able to reach out to you directly because we do have your names and contact information. So with that being said, one more thing again, before we do end, again, today's presentation is available right now on the issuer trainings page of ginniemay.gov, and it is under single family training presentations. Again, the demo will be available later next week, and a My Ginnie Mae portal message and e-notification will be sent to you to notify you of the publication to the website. I will hand it over to Nicole Jackson so that she can close us out.
Thank you all so much for joining. I know we're over. I don't want to keep you anymore, but thank you all so much for joining our validation and testing tool demonstration. We look forward to hearing from those of you whose questions weren't answered today and hearing from you soon. And we'll get back to all of you, especially you, Kat. So sorry about that, on any questions you might have. Thank you all so much for joining. Have a great evening.